Commander Reyes walked into the room like she always did, quietly, without announcement, without the kind of entrance that demanded attention. That was the thing about her. She never needed the room to know she was there. The room always found out on its own. She was 38 years old, medium height, with the kind of build that looked unremarkable in civilian clothes. Not bulky, not towering, just lean and still in the way that certain animals are still before they move. When her hair was pulled back, her face gave nothing away. She carried a coffee cup and a manila folder, and she sat down at the far end of the conference table like she was early for something that hadn't started yet. There were 9 other people in that room. 8 of them were men. Most of them had been in various branches of the military, various levels of government contracting, various corners of the national security apparatus. And they had the handshakes and the posture and the easy confidence of men who had spent their careers being taken seriously in rooms exactly like this one. The 9th person was a woman named Patricia, 50s, civilian, sharp eyes, the kind of woman who had spent 20 years being the smartest person in rooms where nobody acknowledged it. She noticed Commander Reyes the moment she walked in. She was the only one who did. The meeting was a joint operational review, a cross-branch, a cross-agency assessment of a training protocol that had been flagged for revision. It was the kind of meeting that produced memos, the kind of meeting where people defended their decisions from 6 months ago by talking about budget cycles and institutional alignment. Commander Reyes had been in 100 of them. She set her folder on the table and opened it. A man named Garrett, broad shoulders, early 40s, the kind of tan that came from actually being outside rather than a tanning bed, an Army background, now consulting, glanced down the table at her and said to no one in particular, "Did we get someone from admin?" His colleague, a man named Briggs, smiled into his coffee. Commander Reyes turned a page in her folder. She had heard that kind of comment before. She had heard it so many times that it had stopped landing like an insult and started landing like confirmation. Confirmation that she was still the person they underestimated, which meant she was still the person who held the advantage. She had learned a long time ago, in water so cold it stole the breath from your chest before you even registered the temperature, that the moment someone underestimates you is the moment the leverage shifts. You don't correct it. You hold it. You let it compound. So she turned another page. The meeting opened. A facilitator from the Oversight Committee walked everyone through the agenda. Introductions were requested. Name, I rank or title, branch or agency. Standard. They went around the table. Garrett said his name and his consulting firm and mentioned, with the practiced casualness of someone who mentions things very deliberately, that he'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan. Briggs said his credentials included 12 years in Army Special Forces and that he was currently advising 3 separate defense contracts. There were others. See, each one measured out their credibility in deployments and clearances and years of service like men laying cards on a table before a hand has even been dealt. It came around to Commander Reyes. She said her name. She said her rank. She said she was currently serving as a commander in the United States Navy. Garrett smiled. Not at her. Somewhere near her. The kind of smile that was really just a facial adjustment. A small private amusement directed at the middle distance. Commander, he said, drawing the word out just slightly. What's your background? Support? Intelligence? It was not a neutral question. The architecture of it was designed to categorize her before she answered, to put her in one of the boxes that had been built for women in the military for the last several decades. Support, medical, intelligence. The boxes that were important, that were real, but that were not, in the unspoken taxonomy of men like Garrett, in the boxes that carried weight in a room like this one. Commander Reyes looked at him. She held the look for exactly 1 beat longer than was comfortable. Special warfare, she said. The room did not freeze. Not yet. Men like Garrett do not freeze on words alone. They process, they recalibrate, they find the alternative interpretation that preserves the version of the world they walked in with. Coordination? Briggs offered. And the word was generous in the way that a patronizing hand on a shoulder is generous. Operations, she said. She went back to her folder. The facilitator moved on. The meeting continued. But something had shifted in the room's temperature, in the way certain people were now sitting, in the way Garrett was no longer making eye contact with Briggs in the particular way he had been before. The smiles had not disappeared, but they had become more careful. Patricia, at the other end of the table, I did not smile. She watched. She had seen this before, in different rooms, with different stakes. She recognized the shape of what was happening. Commander Reyes had been born in Corpus Christi, Texas, in 1986. Her father was a machinist. Her mother taught 4th grade for 31 years. They were not a military family, not in any traditional sense. Though her grandfather had served in Korea and kept a photograph on his dresser of himself at 22 in a uniform that he wore like it had been made for someone slightly larger. He never talked about what he did there. He talked about the men he was with. She grew up watching her mother manage 30 children a day with the calm authority of someone who understood that authority was not about volume. You did not need to raise your voice if you had already established, through 100 small, consistent moments, that you meant what you said. Her mother never raised her voice. The classroom ran like a clock. Her father was different, expressive, loud, the kind of man who filled a room with his energy and laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. She loved both of them equally, and she had taken something different from each of them. From her mother, the discipline of stillness. From her father, the knowledge that a room responds to a person who is genuinely not afraid of it. She was not a prodigy. She was not the fastest or the strongest or the most gifted student in her class at the Naval Academy. What she was, consistently, was the last person standing when everyone else had found a reason to stop. That was not a dramatic quality. It did not make for good stories at parties. It was simply the thing that, over 17 years, I'd had separated her from a great many people who were faster and stronger and more gifted. BUD/S, Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training, had a dropout rate that hovered around 80% depending on the class. She knew this going in. She had known it for years before she went in. She had spent 3 years preparing for 6 months of training that was specifically designed to find the place inside a person where they kept their reasons for quitting, and then to make those reasons feel reasonable. The water was the hardest part. Not the physical coldness of it, though that was real. The kind of cold that stopped being a sensation and started being a fact. The kind of cold that moved into your thinking and made certain thoughts feel more rational than they were. The hardest part was the duration. It was not that any single moment in the water was unsurvivable. It was that the moments kept coming, and coming, and coming. And at some point the mind began negotiating, began asking whether survival required presence or whether survival could be arranged from somewhere warmer. She did not quit. She did not quit when the instructors stood above her on the beach and told her, with the casual certainty of people who had watched hundreds of people quit, that she was going to quit. She did not quit when certain colleagues made her feel, through 100 small and deliberate interactions, or that her presence was an experiment rather than a fact. She did not quit during Hell Week, during dive physics, during the land warfare phase, during any of the accumulated bruising weight of a process designed to produce, at its end, the smallest possible number of people. She did not quit because of her grandfather's photograph, not because of what it meant, because of what it didn't say. Because her grandfather, who had done things in Korea that he never named for anyone, had kept that photograph on a dresser for 50 years and never once suggested that what was in it belonged only to certain kinds of people. He had simply been in it. He had simply done the thing. And then he had come home and put the photograph on the dresser and taught her to play gin rummy and laughed at her father's jokes before they were finished. She thought about that photograph in the water. She thought about it when the negotiations started. Back in the conference room, the meeting had moved into the operational review. Numbers were being cited. A training protocol for maritime interdiction had produced outcomes that were being assessed as suboptimal, and the question on the table was whether the problem was in the design of the protocol or in the application of it. Garrett was speaking. He was speaking with the authority of someone who had designed similar protocols and was therefore reviewing this one as a peer rather than a student. His analysis was not wrong. Some of it was actually sharp. Commander Reyes listened to it the way she listened to most things, with the part of her attention that evaluated information and the other part that evaluated the person providing it. He had been in Afghanistan. That was real. His record, which she had read before this meeting because she always read the records before meetings, was solid. He was not a fool. And he was simply a man who had arranged his experience into a worldview that left certain doors unopened, and the unopened doors were exactly the ones that made his analysis of this particular protocol incomplete. She waited until he finished. "The failure point isn't the protocol," she said. "It's the assumption built into the training environment. The protocol was designed for conditions that don't exist at the actual interdiction sites. The trainees aren't failing the protocol. The protocol is failing the conditions." The room processed this. Garrett looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. "What's your basis for that assessment?" 8 interdiction operations in the Gulf of Aden between 2019 and 2022, she said. "I ran 3 of them." The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when the information in them has just changed shape. Not dramatically, not with gasps or dropped jaws, just quiet, or the way water goes still after something moves through it. Briggs set down his coffee. Patricia at the other end of the table allowed herself one very small, very private smile. Commander Reyes turned another page in her folder. She had not said it to impress them. She had said it because it was the relevant information, and the relevant information was what the meeting required. She was not interested in the silence that had followed it, and in the recalibration happening in Garrett's expression, in the particular quality of Briggs's stillness. She was interested in the protocol. The protocol was broken, and the people responsible for fixing it were sitting in this room, and they had spent the first 40 minutes of the meeting defending the version of reality they had walked in with. That was the problem. That was what she was here for. Outside, beyond the building's windows, and the city moved in its ordinary afternoon way, traffic and pedestrians, and the low continuous noise of a place that did not know or care what was being decided in this particular room. Commander Reyes had always found that useful, the indifference of everything outside the room. It clarified the importance of everything inside it. She had been doing this for 17 years. She had run operations in water that took your breath before you registered it was there. And she had made decisions in darkness with incomplete information and people's lives in the ledger. She had been the person in rooms who was not supposed to be there, and she had learned, in the way that you only learn things that have been tested against something real, that the room's opinion of your right to be in it was the least important variable in the equation. The most important variable was the work. She turned another page, and the afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and caught the edge of her coffee cup, and she did not notice it, because she was reading, and because there was still a great deal of work to do. The meeting broke for lunch at 12:30 and reconvened at 1:15, and by the time it reconvened, the room had rearranged itself in ways that were invisible, but completely real. Garrett had spent the break on his phone. Miss Briggs had spoken quietly to the facilitator near the coffee station. 2 of the other men had exchanged a look when they thought no one was watching that contained, in its brief duration, an entire renegotiation of how the afternoon was going to go. These were not dramatic gestures. They were the small adjustments of people who had encountered unexpected information and were deciding what to do with it. What they were deciding, Commander Reyes understood, and was whether to incorporate her or to manage her. Those were the two options that men in rooms like this one typically arrived at when a woman turned out to be more than they had accounted for. Incorporation meant treating the new information as simply information, updating the model, moving forward. Management meant finding a way to acknowledge the credential without allowing it to fundamentally alter the room's power structure. She had seen both. She preferred incorporation, and not for sentimental reasons, but because it produced better work. Managed experts were experts performing inside a box, and boxes made the work worse. The afternoon session opened with a shift in Garrett's approach that was noticeable only to someone who had been watching closely. He did not apologize for the morning. Men like Garrett did not apologize for the morning, not directly, but he began directing questions toward her. Not deferring, directing. There was a difference. And deference was what you did when you were uncertain. Direction was what you did when you were trying to establish new terms for a collaboration you had not anticipated needing. She answered the questions. She stayed on the protocol. The protocol was the issue. Not the politics of the room, not the morning's dynamics, not the way certain people were now sitting slightly differently than they had been before. And the protocol had been designed by people who had excellent theoretical knowledge of maritime interdiction and imperfect practical knowledge of the specific bodies of water where the operations were actually conducted. This gap, between the designed environment and the real one, was producing trained operators who were technically proficient and situationally unprepared. That was the problem. That was what needed to be fixed. She walked them through it with the kind of precision that comes from having done the thing, not studied it. She knew what the water felt like at 3 in the morning in the Gulf of Aden in November. She knew what a small vessel's engine sounded like from 200 meters in conditions of low visibility. She knew how the interaction between tidal patterns and vessel approach angles created windows of approximately 6 minutes where an interdiction either succeeded or didn't, and how the current training protocol's timing assumptions were built around a different body of water entirely. By 3 o'clock, the room had shifted again. This time, it was not invisible. This time, it was the kind of shift that you could see in the way people held their pens and the speed at which they were writing. Garrett had stopped defending the protocol and had started asking about the specific modifications that would close the gap. Briggs had his laptop open and was pulling documentation. 2 of the men who had said almost nothing all morning were now asking questions that were pointed and smart and engaged. Patricia was watching all of it with an expression that contained, somewhere behind the professional composure, something that looked like satisfaction. Commander Reyes worked through the afternoon. She did not pace herself. She did not manage her energy for effect. She simply worked. This was something that people often misread about her. They expected drama from a woman with her credentials, expected either the aggressive performance of someone who had spent a career proving themselves or the careful restraint of someone who had learned to make herself small. She was neither. She had passed through both of those modes in her 20s, had worn them both, and found them both exhausting and both beside the point, and had arrived somewhere on the other side of them that was simply the work. The work was the thing. Everything else was weather. She had learned this, as she had learned most things that actually held, in conditions that did not allow for anything else. There was a moment during BUD/S. She never talked about this, not because it was dramatic, but because it was too small to explain the weight it carried. When she had been in the water for what felt like a continuous forever, the cold having long since stopped being a sensation and become a kind of baseline reality, and an instructor had come down to the waterline and said very simply, "You can stop." Not cruelly, not with the practiced contempt that some of the instructors used as a tool, just as a statement of available fact. You can stop. She had looked at the instructor and thought, with the particular clarity that extreme cold sometimes produced, about what stopping would mean. Not in terms of the career, not in terms of what people would think, not in terms of any narrative she was part of, just in terms of the next hour. What the next hour would look like if she stayed in the water versus if she got out of it. The next hour in the water would be the same as the current hour in the water. Cold, tiring, without resolution. The next hour out of the water would be warmer. She would be able to feel her hands again. She had thought about this very carefully. And then she had thought about something else, which was that the question of whether to stop was a question she had already answered months before she got in the water in the gymnasium of a Navy facility in Coronado during a preparatory assessment where an instructor had asked the candidates what they were there for, and she had said to herself before she said anything out loud that she was there because she intended to finish. Intentions, she had understood even then, were not feelings. The feelings changed with the temperature of the water. Intentions were decisions made in advance, in conditions that did not yet require them, so that when the conditions arrived and the feelings changed, the decision had already been made. She stayed in the water. She had stayed in it approximately 400 times after that, in the various forms that the question took over the course of training and then over the course of a career. The water was never exactly the same. The question was always exactly the same. She always answered it the same way. The meeting ended at 4:45. Protocol revisions were assigned, timelines were set, follow-up meetings were scheduled. Garrett walked over to her when the room was breaking up and shook her hand and said, with the directness of a man who had decided to incorporate rather than manage, that he had not been prepared for the depth of her operational background and that the afternoon had been productive because of it. She thanked him. She meant it. Not because she needed the acknowledgement. She had stopped needing that around year 4, when she understood that the acknowledgement and the quality of the work were not actually connected, and that optimizing for one was not the same as optimizing for the other. She thanked him because he was right that the afternoon had been productive, and because she respected the fact that he had been able to update his position. A lot of people could not do that. The inability to update, to take in new information and let it actually change the model, rather than getting processed and filed somewhere where it couldn't disturb anything, was one of the most expensive intellectual habits she had encountered in her career. It was expensive in meetings, and it was expensive in operations, and it had cost actual lives in situations she did not think about in conference rooms. Garrett was capable of updating. That was worth acknowledging. Patricia caught up with her in the hallway outside the conference room. She was moving with the purposefulness of someone who had something to say and had decided that the time to say it was now rather than in the gradual erosion of later. I've been in military-adjacent work for 22 years, Patricia said. I have never seen anyone handle that room the way you handled it. Commander Reyes considered this. I didn't handle the room, she said. I handled the protocol problem. Patricia smiled. That's exactly what I mean. They walked out of the building into the late afternoon. The city around them, ordinary and indifferent, and moving in the way cities move when they have no investment in the importance of what just happened inside any particular building. The sky was the specific gray of late February, low and even, the kind of sky that committed to nothing. Commander Reyes stood outside for a moment before her car arrived. Now, she was thinking about the protocol revisions and the timeline, and whether the follow-up meeting in 3 weeks would hold the specific personnel commitments that had been made this afternoon, or whether the room would reassemble with slightly different configurations and require the same ground to be covered from a different angle. That happened. It happened frequently. The work was rarely a straight line. She was also thinking in the quieter register that ran beneath the work-level thinking. It's about something Garrett had said in the morning that she had not responded to, and had not intended to respond to, and had already, without deciding to, entirely released. He had said, "Did we get someone from admin?" And the words had moved through her, and she had felt, in the precise location where certain things landed, before she decided what to do with them, the familiar small impact of a comment designed to reduce. how she had felt it, and she had turned a page in her folder, and she had let the comment exist behind her while she moved forward. This was not heroic. It was not patient in the way that required effort. It was simply what happened when you had answered the question about who you were, often enough in conditions that actually tested the answer. The question, did we get someone from admin, was not a question that could touch anything real. It was whether. You dressed for it and walked through it, and it was already gone. Her car arrived. She got in. The driver asked if she had a good day, and she said it had been productive, which was true. And she looked out the window at the city moving past and thought about the 3 revisions she wanted to draft before the follow-up meeting and the email she needed to send tonight, and the call she had scheduled for 6:30 with a colleague in Bahrain about a separate and unrelated and considerably more complicated situation. She did not think about the morning. The morning was already data, already filed, and already behind her in the way that things went when they had been processed and found to contain nothing that required carrying. The city moved. The sky stayed gray. She opened her folder. There was still work to do. The drive took 22 minutes. In that time, she drafted in her head and the structural outline of the first revision and identified 2 specific points in the second revision where the existing data was insufficient and new data would need to be collected before any change to the protocol could be implemented responsibly. She also thought about her grandfather. She thought about him specifically in the way she had thought about him in the water, not as a symbol, not as a source of inspiration in any narrative sense, but as a simple fact. He had done the thing. And he had come home. He had put the photograph on the dresser and played gin rummy. She had done the thing. She was going home. She had a call at 6:30. The continuity between those 2 facts, his and hers, was not something she would ever articulate to anyone because it was not something that translated into words without becoming smaller than it actually was. It was simply something she carried, in the way that you carry things that are too large for language, quietly, or without exhibition, the way the water carries everything that moves through it and shows none of it on its surface. She closed the folder, not because she was done, because she was home. The driver stopped the car. She thanked him by name, because she always thanked people by name. And she got out, and the evening was cold, and she walked to her door and inside and put the folder on the kitchen table and stood in her own kitchen for a moment in the specific silence of a place that asked nothing of her. Then she made coffee. Then she sat down. Then she opened the folder again. The work was still there. It was always still there. She did not mind. 3 weeks later, the follow-up meeting was not the same room. The room was larger. The table was longer. And there were 16 people instead of 10. And 4 of them were senior enough that the facilitator had added a formal agenda and name placards and a projector that someone had tested twice before the meeting began. There were 2 generals present, 1 admiral, and a woman from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, whose title was long enough that it required its own line on the name placard. Garrett had brought the protocol revisions. He had done the work cleanly, but had incorporated the structural changes with precision and without ego. And when he presented them, he cited Commander Reyes's operational data 3 separate times with the directness of a man who had decided that accuracy mattered more than credit allocation. She noted this. She did not comment on it. The admiral was named Howell. He was 61 years old, had 38 years of service, and had a face that had been shaped by decades of decisions made in conditions that did not allow for extended deliberation. He sat at the far end of the table from Commander Reyes, and he reviewed the revised protocol document with the particular intensity of someone who was not looking for something to approve, but something to break. He found 2 things. He said so, plainly, and with the economy of language that comes from having learned that everything unnecessary in communication is also a liability. He pointed to a timing assumption in the 3rd revision and a resource allocation model in the 5th that he believed were still calibrated to conditions that were not current. The room received this. Commander Reyes looked at the sections he had flagged. He was right about one of them. The timing assumption was a holdover from the original protocol that had survived the revision process because it was nested inside a different operational parameter and had not been isolated for independent review. It needed to change. She said so, with the same economy, and the Admiral looked at her with an expression that contained neither surprise nor performance, just the clean acknowledgement of correct information. He was not entirely right about the other one. The resource allocation model looked misaligned from a surface reading, but the apparent misalignment was a function of a documentation convention that was particular to Gulf of Aden operations and was not standard across the broader training framework. She explained this. She explained it with the specific data, walking through the logic at the speed of someone who had been through it enough times to know exactly where it was most likely to be misread. And the Admiral was quiet for a moment after she finished. "What's your operational background?" he said. Not because he didn't know. His staff had sent him the personnel files before the meeting. His question was the kind that senior officers sometimes asked when they wanted to see how someone answered, not what they answered. The texture of the response, the ease or discomfort with which a person named their own credentials. 17 years active, she said. Special Warfare Command. In 8 Gulf interdiction operations, 2 counter-proliferation task force assignments, currently overseeing training protocol development for maritime special operations. She said it the way she said everything, without decoration, without the performative modesty that some women used in these situations to make their credentials more palatable to rooms that hadn't expected them, and without the compensatory assertiveness that other women used to preempt the doubt before it arrived. She said it as information because it was information, and because the Admiral had asked for information and that was what he was going to get. He nodded, turned to the rest of the table. "The timing issue needs to be corrected before this goes to final review," he said. "The allocation model stands. Commander Reyes, I want you leading the implementation subgroup." The room absorbed this. The woman from the Secretary of Defense's office made a note, and Garrett looked at his copy of the document. Briggs, who was also in this room, kept his expression professional and still, which itself communicated something. Commander Reyes said she could do that. She said it the way she said that she would do things, simply without preamble, because adding preamble to an acceptance was its own form of performance, and she was not performing. The meeting continued. She led her section of it. She ran the subgroup discussion with the same discipline she brought to everything, direct, structured, moving the room toward decisions rather than toward more conversation about the decisions. She had learned early in her career that meetings that ended with clarity were a form of leadership, and meetings that ended with more meetings were a form of failure, and she conducted herself accordingly. The woman from the Secretary of Defense's office, her name was Dr. Amara Liu, which was on the name placard, and she had worked in national security policy for 19 years and had seen a great many meetings in a great many rooms, watched Commander Reyes work through the afternoon and thought, with the specific quality of thought that came from long professional experience, that she was watching something that did not happen often enough, and that the rarity of it said something true and unflattering about the structures that had produced it. She introduced herself to Commander Reyes after the meeting ended. They spoke for 11 minutes in the hallway outside the large conference room, while the building settled into its end-of-day sounds around them. Dr. Liu asked questions, and Commander Reyes answered them without the careful filtering that people sometimes applied when speaking to someone from the Secretary's office. She answered them as she answered everything, with the information available to her accurately, yet without strategic omission. Dr. Liu asked what she thought the single most significant structural gap in current maritime special operations training was. Commander Reyes thought about this for exactly the length of time it took to think about it accurately, which was not a long time. "We're training people to survive conditions we've already documented," she said. We're not training them to adapt to conditions we can't yet document. The water changes. The threats change. Hey, we build the protocol after the last operation. We need to build the protocol before the next one. Dr. Liu wrote something in the notebook she was carrying. I'd like to have a longer conversation about this, she said. Commander Reyes said she was available. She drove home in the same city, the same gray evening. All a different 3 weeks having passed and deposited their accumulated weight of work and documentation and revision and decisions made in rooms where the stakes were real even when the rooms looked, from the outside, like any other conference room in any other federal building in a city full of them. She sat in the back of the car and she was tired in the specific way that was different from being depleted. Tired in the way that came from having used herself fully, from having brought everything available to a task that required everything available. And the tiredness was clean, and it sat in her body like something that had been earned. She thought about her mother's classroom. The 30 children managed with the calm authority of someone who understood that authority was not about volume. The clock that ran because the person at the front of it had established, through 100 small, consistent moments, that she meant what she said. And her mother had been doing that for 31 years. 31 years of children who did not know, when they were 8 years old in a classroom in Corpus Christi, that the person at the front of the room had built something invisible and structural that would shape how they understood authority for the rest of their lives. Who would not know until they were adults, if they ever knew at all. Now that the unremarkable calm of that room was not a natural feature of the space, but a thing that one woman had built and maintained every day, without ceremony, without anyone watching. Commander Reyes understood her mother differently now than she had at 8. She understood her the way you understand things that you've had to rebuild in yourself from first principles. Her mother had not made it look effortless because it was effortless. She had made it look effortless because she had decided, somewhere early and completely, that the effort was hers to carry, and that carrying it was not a burden, but a choice, and that the choice, made consistently over 31 years, was the work itself. She was her mother's daughter. She had just been doing it in different rooms, in different water, in the dark. The car stopped. She got out. The evening was cold, and the street was quiet, and she stood outside her door for a moment in the particular stillness of a person who has not yet decided to go inside, who is standing at the exact threshold between the day's demands and the evening's release, feeling the weight of both. She had been in this work for 17 years. She would likely be in it for another 15 or 20, or until the work changed shape in some way that required her to change with it. She did not know what the next 15 years would look like in their specifics. She knew what they would look like in their structure. Early mornings, difficult rooms, the constant and renewable experience of being in a place where someone had decided in advance that she did not fully belong, and the constant and renewable experience of doing the work anyway, and of the work speaking clearly enough that eventually, not always immediately, not always easily, but eventually, the room updated. And the rooms always updated. That was the thing she had learned that she had not known going in. Not all of them, not fully, not without friction, but the rooms that contained people who were actually there to do the work rather than to protect the version of the world they had arrived with. Those rooms updated. She had watched it happen enough times to trust that it would happen again. Garrett had updated. The Admiral had been, from the start, simply oriented toward the work. Doctor. But Lou was oriented toward the work. Patricia had recognized her from across the room before she said a single word. The rooms were not all the same. The work was the constant. She went inside. She put the folder on the table. She made coffee. She sat down and opened her laptop and wrote the first draft of an email to Dr. Liu, outlining the structural framework she had described in the hallway, the training model that was built for the next operation rather than the last one, set the architecture of preparation for conditions that could not yet be documented. She wrote it clearly and completely and without hedging, because hedging was a form of managing the reader's reaction before they'd had it, and managing the reader's reaction was a thing you did when you were not confident that the work could carry itself, and the work could carry itself. She sent it. She sat for a moment in the kitchen's quiet, the coffee cooling beside her. In the evening around the house doing its ordinary evening things. She thought about her grandfather, which she did not do often but did do consistently, the way you return to a place that taught you something without being able to name what it taught you at the time. He had done the thing. He had come home. He had put the photograph on the dresser. He had died when she was 16, on a Tuesday morning in March, as in a hospital bed with her grandmother holding his hand and the window showing a sky that was the same particular gray as today's. And in the years that followed, she had thought many times about what he had not said in the weeks before the end. He had not talked about what he had done. He had not tried to pass it on, to make sure she understood the significance of it, to curate his own legacy in the way that people sometimes did when they could feel the end arranging itself in front of them. He had talked about her father's jokes. He had taught her gin rummy. He had asked her, on the last afternoon she spent with him, whether she had decided what she wanted to do with her life, and when she said she was thinking about the Navy, he had looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not fully understood at 16 and had been understanding incrementally ever since. He had not said anything. He had nodded. That nod had been worth 1,000 explanations. She understood now what had been in it. Not pride exactly, though pride was part of it. Something older. The recognition, in the face of a 16-year-old who was her father's daughter and her mother's daughter and her own nascent self in equal parts, of someone who was going to go find out what they were made of, who was going to get in the water, who was going to stay in the water. He had known that before she had. She finished the coffee. She closed the laptop. She stood up and walked through her apartment and turned off the kitchen light and stood in the darkness for a moment before going to bed, not from sentimentality or drama, but from the simple animal pleasure of standing still after a day of motion. 17 years, 8 operations, dozens of rooms, hundreds of small and deliberate moments where someone's expectation of her had been constructed out of a category rather than a fact, and where she had let the expectation exist and done the work and watched the room update. She was not finished. The work was not finished. Dr. Liu's notebook had her name in it, and the follow-up meeting would produce another follow-up meeting, and the water was always changing, and the protocol was always in need of the next revision, and there was always more work. She turned off the last light. In the morning, she would get up early, as she always did. And she would make coffee and open the folder, and the work would be there, patient and real and entirely indifferent to who had expected her to be doing it. That was the only kind of work she had ever been interested in. She went to sleep.